It's hardly new that great leaders include people of color, and it goes without saying that they reflect their community. What has long been a struggle is the power to define leaders and their community from within. One example of that in Boston is a book of portraits in pictures and prose by a local photographer and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. The book, Portraits of Purpose, will be the springboard for an event at City Hall on February 8th, a leadership bridge to the next generation. To tell us about the event and the book are the co-author and photographer Don West and a collaborator in the event, the founder and former director of Boston Youth Theater, Elaine Koury. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Yes.
I want to start with Don because you really started working on this, like maybe going back to the 1980s. So
1997.
1997,
yes.
And of course your work as a photographer preceded that as well.
Right.
What makes a leader in your mind?
Well, I discovered leaders as a photographer, news photographer, and event photographer through the 80s and the 90s. And those individuals were people I would call people of conscience. People who saw issues and problems that needed to be solved and stepped up to the plate and took some action. One of them, who was probably most well known in Boston, is Mel King, who's been a community activist for the last, 50-some or more years. And still doing it at about almost 90 years old now. So he is a perfect example of what leadership is all about. It's about taking part and being involved in your community.
Elaine, what about your idea of a leader? Because these days, if it isn't Trump, it's Oprah, and is it all celebrities?
No, and I think one of the things that we want to be sure that our young people understand is the ways that they can tell the real McCoy, if you will. They're bombarded with so many messages from so many different places. It's hard without the social context to figure out what is the real deal. All of the people in this particular production are really the real deal. They have worked their whole lives towards social justice in Boston.
John, what about the pictures? Leaders function with other people, and one example I love is your photo of Keith Motley, the recent and former chancellor at UMass Boston, right, with, I guess, a student, right?
True. That was a situation where actually Hubie Jones, who was a great leader in this city, was being honored, and Keith Motley was asked to speak, but someone had to introduce Keith Motley. And it was a young Hispanic fellow who had many accomplishments himself, and he got up and he spoke and he gave a great introduction to Keith. And as he was leaving the podium, Keith was coming up, and Keith grabbed him around the shoulder and pulled him up with him and made some comments about him and brought him forward. And to me, I use that picture in the book and in the exhibit because it really spoke to who Keith Motley really is. He's about bringing young people up and educating them and making them strong.
Well, he had ambitious plans to raise really the level of expectations at UMass. And what also comes across, which has been going on even before he was at UMass, he was a real favorite. The students love this guy.
Yes, yes. I mean, and you can see in this picture also the size of Keith. Keith is about 6'7", and this young man was probably about 5'8", 9", and you could just see how he fathered him at that moment, and how kind of demure the young man was in the picture. But yes, that's what he's all about, young people.
Elaine, Don tells a story in one frame. You're going to have people telling stories. Well, it's going to play out a bit longer. This is a work of theater, so explain how this is going to happen on February 8th.
Well, it started with me interviewing these people, doing about a 3-hour interview, and then trying to distill that down into a 4-minute story or monologue. Now, these are not stories like Once Upon a Time type stories, but rather life stories, stories from their own experiences. And Keith, by the way, is one of the people in the play. So each one will be telling, in a certain sense, a piece of their story to these young people to give them a sense of how you become a leader, or at least how they became leaders.
Chris, Elaine, you also worked with students for many years, even at Boston English, I think.
Yes.
What is it about telling a story that brings out the leader in a person?
I think when you tell your own story, it requires you to look back at moments that were transformative for you. And I think what really makes a good leader is somebody who can help other people transform their lives. So I think that's why the stories.
John, another leader that you took a photo of, somebody who I guess is as much as a celebrity as anybody we've mentioned already, and that's Nelson Mandela. He came to Boston, was in the 1990s, around 1990.
Well, no, actually, well, yes. 19, oh goodness, I forgot the year. 1990 maybe, was it? Somewhere in there, yeah.
And he landed in Logan Airport, drove through the neighborhoods, appeared here, and then he went up to the Esplanade, and that's where your photo of him was taken.
That photo was taken underneath the hatch shell in one of the holding rooms, one of the big rooms underneath there, before we all went up, and he went up on the stage and was greeted by 30,000 people. So that was quite a spectacular day. I had the opportunity to be his photographer for the 2 days he was in Boston, and probably of all my experiences in life, that was one of the greatest highlights.
Now, I look at your photo of him, and it reminds me a little bit about Obama, actually. That there's this smile that looks pretty uncontrived, relaxed almost, which may be a true indicator of character, but talk about some other things, because you shook this man's hand. What was that like? Well,
as I've mentioned before, he was a boxer in his young life, and he has very large hands. He's a tall man, 6'1", and my little hand just got lost in his big hand. But it was a moment, a very precious moment for me. We were at the Kennedy Library at that moment, waiting to go downstairs, and we were in a room with all the Kennedy family. And he kind of slipped away for a moment to look at the artifacts in the room, and I said, this is my opportunity to say hello and pay my respect, which I did, and in that process we shook hands, and so I can say I touched Mandela.
Elaine, maybe this has happened already, but I guess it should be happening on February 8th. You're going to have something like that again. You're going to have these younger students probably shaking hands, talking to some of these other leaders from an earlier generation. What do you see in that?
Exactly. We're going to have 120 leaders from the Boston Public Schools, students from the Boston Public Schools, who will attend the event. They will basically go through this series of meetings with them in a certain sense, because as each one tells their story, the groups of students are going to be small, so that they'll be able to look eyeball to eyeball, as it were, with these people. And then after the theater piece is over, there's a reception, during which time the young people will have the opportunity to go back and shake hands or get an autograph or take a selfie with or ask a question of these extraordinary people.
I've also got to ask you about one question, because you're in one of Don's photos with some other leaders, I guess. Talk about that.
I was the director of Boston Youth Theater for 11 years, and that was a racially mixed, really original theater company here in the city of Boston. And that picture was with young people from Boston Youth Theater. We would create our own plays based around the issues that were important to young people at that time.
John, another thing is about how you tell a story. There's a photo of Deval Patrick there, and it's hard to look at that as simply a photo of one person. It's really about what was going on there.
Well, that was the night before his first inauguration, and it was in a local church, and it was a laying on of hands of the local ministers. And there were probably about a dozen or so ministers there that evening. And my choice of a photograph to try to capture that was, as you may be seeing on the screen now, I'm not sure, but it's kind of a close-up of Governor Patrick and some hands of the different ministers laying on, blessing him and wishing him well as he goes forward into the task he was about to undertake.
Now, in mainstream political media, some people might just provincialize that as well. That's just, his base. But that's central to your story. Why is it central?
Well, it's central to people connecting, spirit. Something more than just the politics of the day, something that has something to do with the heart rather than the head. And I think we need more of that within our complexity of society, that we need more heart and more understanding of each other.
Elaine, what about for students the importance of seeing themselves at the center of a story instead of reacting to someone else's story?
I think that one of the things we want them to understand is that if they look around them and they say, oh, whoa, that's wrong, that they have a responsibility, as we have as well, but that they have a responsibility to try to make it righter. You can't always make it all the way right, but to try to make it more right. And they are the heroes of those stories. And that's what we're trying to put across to them, the whole idea that these people that they're meeting are people who will have done that in their lives, whether it be in healthcare or education or politics. One of the people in the play is Senator Linda Dorsina-Forey, who, as you may know, was the first black woman representative for South Boston. And these are people who have looked around and said, wait a minute, that's wrong and I'm going to fix it. And we're encouraging them to be the center of their story and to make their own fixes.
We should mention about the time and place of the event. It's going to be in City Hall February 8th?
February 8th, 5:30.
And Dawn, if people want to catch up with Portraits of Purpose by you and Ken Cooper, or some way they can get some more information about that?
They can go to our website, which is portraitsofpurpose.us, and kind of remember that it's US, not .com, but portraitsofpurpose.us, all one word.
Thank you very much for being with us, Don West and
Thank you. Thank
Elaine
you.
Koury. We'll have more news in just a moment.